Hey everybody, this is going to be a supplemental Photoshop tutorial demo on specifically layers and layer masks and making selections, but then I'm also going to go through some various uses of this and some Photoshop files that I have. So this is the same little model from previous demo that I had showed, and it has a layer mask that looks something like this. In order to view that layer mask, I just hold Alt and I click on it. Now these keys are different on the Mac, of course, because everything has to be just a little bit different. However, all of the keystrokes are listed on Adobe's website. So they list both the Windows side and the Mac side. So if you just Google default keyboard shortcuts Photoshop, you'll be able to find this link and basically translate anything from Mac to PC or PC to Mac. So this is pretty helpful. It's literally all several hundred of them. I mean, these are just ways you can filter. There's a ton. So that's a good resource to use. Anyways, so back to this. So I'm just going to hit Alt to look at this guy. So it's a black and white image, and it's effectively a selection. So if I were to, again, just holding Alt and clicking on it will take me back and forth. You can see here that on my layer panel, I can have different layers selected, and then I can have the layer mask selected or the layer itself. And you can see there's a little box that forms around whatever I have selected. If you want to make these larger or smaller, if you right-click in the area below it, you can make them into large thumbnails, medium, or small. I'm doing medium. I usually use small, but for the sake of the demo, I think it hopefully is a little bit easier to see for you. Oops, leave that where it is. We're not going to cover paths or channels right now. We're really going to focus on layers. So as I said, this is effectively a selection. If you hold Shift and click on it, and this one's the same for Mac and PC, I can attest to, it essentially turns that layer mask off. So you should see an X across it, and that just means it's no longer being used. The useful thing here is that you can sort of test it and see if it's looking correct, or try it out basically. And it's a non-committal thing, so it just undoes itself. You can see there is a lock that's between the two. I can click on it and it'll go away, and I can click back and it'll come back. What that means is that if it is locked, if I move one, so if I move this guy, I'm also moving the layer mask attached to it. However, if it's unlocked and I move this guy, you can see the image in the background is moving, but my layer mask is staying in the same place. That's not very useful in this circumstance. So I'm going to leave them locked, and that's just clicking between the two. So since this is a black and white image where white is transparent and black is opaque, I'm just going to bring up the standard brush tool, set my opacity to white, or my brush to white. Right now I have it selected. You can see the box is around the layer mask. If I start drawing with my brush set to white, it will make, I'm going to make this into a hard brush, it'll make the image reappear. So this is actually just the background of the image. See here, now I can make that all reappear. And that's essentially adding to this layer mask. You can see here, if I draw white, it appears. Get rid of that. So all you really have to do is edit this black and white image, and there's lots of ways to do that. So you can continue editing layer mask infinitely. So even if you've made your selection, you've done this, and you want to come back and say, oh, I wish this weren't here. This time I'm going to paint with black. I can just get rid of it. And it is gone. Of course, that's only gone because it's in the layer mask. Just going to undo that. The other thing I can do is sometimes I want to make that layer mask into a selection again. In this case, I'm holding Control, which I think the Command key on Mac is the equivalent. If I'm holding Control, my mouse will get this little square over it as I hover over the layer, this guy here. When I click it, basically that layer mask becomes a selection again. So you can see I have the little dancing lines around my my selection. So I can now use the same standard select tool. So if I wanted to edit the selection using, say, the polygonal lasso tool, I can do that again. and make the same sort of changes in the same way as I had. I could also, under selection, say select inverse. So instead of selecting the object now, I'm actually selecting the opposite. So I'm selecting the background. There may be times where inverting the selection will be very useful for you. I can also do adjustments to my selection now. So I could sort of modify and do a feather, which will soften all the edges. Visually, it doesn't look any different, but I'm going to actually just turn that off. And I have another layer here that's a copy, and I'm just going to apply it now. And we can't really see, so I'm going to make a background layer. And the way I did that is this button with a square and the plus. That is just create new layer. And it's pretty useful. It just creates a blank layer that is transparent. And I'm just going to drop some orange into it just so we can see what that looks like. If we look at the edges of this thing now, they kind of have an orange glow, and that's because I softened that selection. So we can compare. You can see this has mostly harder lines against that background than these sort of softened lines, which, again, there may be times in which the softer selection looks good. I mean, in a way, it looks like this is enveloped in the orange background, which there may be design reasons why you want to do that. Again, I do that sometimes on people when rendering them into Photoshop because it helps them appear more part of the background when they don't have as hard an edge on their in their silhouette against the background. The light is actually wrapping around them a little bit, or gives the appearance of that. This is sometimes called bloom. It's a sort of synonymous thing. Bloom can be done in other ways too. There are technically more accurate ways of doing it, but the way that I showed, just using the sort of softening the edges, using the feather command, works pretty well without being nearly as complicated as more advanced bloom features. Okay, so that's the kind of selection, and I'm just going to go through the sort of selecting process again. So of course we have the various lassos, which if you hold down any of these commands over here, you can get to. So the generic lasso tool, which just draws, not very precise, polygonal, which makes straight lines, and magnetic. Magnetic is pretty useful as it tries to find edges. But of course, nothing is perfect. Under the square, or the rectangle here, we have the rectangle, ellipse, and some other ones that I don't really ever use. And then the magic wand, which of course is very useful. Those are your basic selections. And once you have a selection, so I'm just going to copy this guy out again just by holding the Control or Command on Mac, selecting it. So now I have that selection. Now what was I going to do with it? Well, there is this button down here beneath your paint colors, which is the Reveal Mask tool, which basically just paints everything with a red hue that isn't being selected, and that can be very useful. I think that's probably all I'll cover on the selection tool for now. I might come back to this in a little bit if I think of something else. But I'm going to start talking about layers. So I'm going to go to what is possibly one of my most layer-dense Photoshop files that I have. So I made this actually when I was in grad school on a co-op for a firm, GBN, which is a firm in Cincinnati. I did all the renderings for this project, and this is a built building that is in Cincinnati. Was completed a few years ago. But this one was interesting because the client was working with a landscape designer who wanted to see extremely precise versions of trees. So everything in this image, I had to go out and find the exact correct trees and plants in order to satisfy the client and the landscape engineer who we were working with. I even got some criticism for having my grass be too tall and look unkempt, as they described it. But I think this is the same sort of technique that I had actually showed in the demo the other day of just sort of softening the edges to allow the grass to appear to be coming through. This is something you all may have to do at some point, of really going out and finding 2D versions of trees and bringing them in and trying to make them look convincingly like they're part of a composition. So I'm just going to actually turn all of my layers off and show you sort of where this thing began, which is a render that looked like this. Not particularly amazing looking, pretty dull, pretty unexciting. Of course, if you put a sky behind it, that can help a bit. Gives it a bit of context, of course. Some adjustments in here. You see I put the sky into the windows, so it looks like they're reflecting that sky. And let's see, turn some more things on. That was just some adjustments to the stone to get them more accurate to the color that we were aiming for. This category here, which I call noise textures. I think I had talked about this one day, but essentially I'm going to turn off the layer mask and set this to normal. Essentially, it's an image that looks exactly like this, kind of noisy, kind of dirty, kind of blurry. I had set this to a low opacity, turned it to an overlay type, and applied it only to, let's see here, looks like just a brick. And that was to break up that texture to make it look a little bit more uneven. So it didn't really matter that that texture is kind of not very brick-like, not very stone-like, just kind of noisy, because that was its purpose. The same thing for all the, I don't know exactly where these are. It looks like they're very light. Let's turn them up. Some more adjustments to the stone here, again, just to kind of break up that pattern. Similarly, this is just a texture that I took, scaled kind of to the general area that I needed it to be on, set it to overlay, turn the opacity down quite a bit. Might have been hard light. So there's various different layer types which are here. All of them do something different. The ones I mentioned before are sort of multiply and screen, which are inverses of each other. When you're trying to overlay textures on one another, the overlay, soft light, sometimes hard light, vivid light, linear light can be good ways of doing that, as they tend to merge things a little bit better. Overlay being my most often go-to. You can see here, if we turn this up, we get a little bit more texture of that stone, and that's just sort of overlaying on top. So grass, which of course in this case I found some internet image of a beautiful grassy field and overlaid it. Of course there's a lot of layers to that process just to get it really nice and correct. I also have some texture on the asphalt surface here just to break it up some. I'm not going to go into these too much, but just to show you that this is the layer mask for that grass that is indeed coming through, so that the grass sort of wraps up and over that sign a bit. Next, that was just a small adjustment. So something I often will do in renderings, which we had to do in the last assignment, is include line work on top of drawings. So this is this to normal. Just the line work of the project. This doesn't have any line weights on it or anything in this case, because it really was meant to be very subtle as part of this. And it helps give you a little definition to edges. So multiply, what it does is it takes that image and it essentially uses the image itself, as a layer mask. So white being transparent, black being opaque, the black lines remain opaque and show through, whereas if I went to screen, it really doesn't do much. And actually what we can't see is that we can see through the black lines right now. They're just not very useful because they're very thin. But it's essentially the inverse, where black is transparent and white is opaque. So when applying lines like this, you always want to be using multiply. And I think subtlety with this sort of thing is a good idea, so turn down the opacity quite a bit. You don't need to have those hard lines, especially in areas where you have a lot of dense lines in the same area, like that railing. Turning it down a bit is very helpful to not be distracting. All right, so the nature one. There's a lot going on here. That's the wrong one. And this is also why it's very important to keep good layer management, because if I were to open all these folders at once, it's just trees upon trees upon trees upon trees upon trees upon trees, and so on and so forth. All of these were just found online, just Googling silhouette trees, silhouette plants. A lot of the websites that I actually got these from no longer exist, so they're not great resources to share because they don't exist anymore. But there's still tons of, probably more websites out now than there ever were when I was making this. So the options are pretty endless. As I mentioned in my last tutorial, just kind of painting on some tones. So you can see here how I warmed up this area in the center and painted some cool tones around the outside. Bring the focus in. Of course, I had a squirrel somewhere in the image. People are obviously very important, possibly the most important thing in any of your renderings, because we don't understand scale without seeing people. Even though doors may be sort of familiar to us, they can change. A typical door in a residential project may be 6'8", but a normal door, without even getting super fancy, it can go to 10 feet, not uncommonly. So the difference between those two is pretty remarkable. So using that as a scale really isn't enough. Using people, understanding people as a scale in a building is truly what's important. So of course the curves adjustments, I have 2 curves adjustments in here. I'm not entirely sure why. This is something that we'll get to at a later time. This is what's called a material ID layer. It's part of the rendering process, but what it allows you to do is, using the magic wand tool, if I wanted to say select all that stone in the project, I can use this to select everything that is that particular color. I'm going to turn my tolerance down. And essentially, it makes perfect selections every time of exactly where that material is being used in the project. Again, this is something you can only get out of a rendering engine, a true rendering process. So not something we're doing yet, not something you need to worry about, but something we will talk about later on. And again, this project, I'm not going to say that it's not my design, not something, I worked on the rendering side and was very much sort of working with the client and what they were specifically looking for. So it's a very, unlike most of the other work I've done. This is actually from, again, when I was in grad school, some of my thesis work. And it's a very abstract, atmospheric rendering with a lot of fog and smoke, meant to sort of replicate the idea of this proposal that I had coming out of the fog, like an illusion, like a oasis, like a mirage type of thing. And I'm not going to go too detailed into how this Photoshop file is put together because there's, of course, a ton of layers. But I will show you sort of where it began, which is a very simple rendering, nothing too much going on here, some shadows, some light, and then just a lot of effects. But when talking about layers in Photoshop, it's good to understand that layers build on top of one another. Unlike in Rhino, where layers don't really have a hierarchy of what's on top of one another, Photoshop does. The higher up you move in Photoshop, the higher it is on top of your composition. So if you have something opaque on this layer here, it will cover up anything that is beneath it. So it's good to understand that Photoshop has that layer hierarchy where it's physically at a higher space. You can see here that I have all the buildings that sort of just randomly appear. This is a fun technique that we'll also do at a later time, which is essentially all of the buildings in this project were just sort of rendered with basic shadows, and then had the faces of the buildings cropped on just using, I went to the site, I went here, photographed each of the face kind of approximately, and then just overlaid it. And from a distance, you can't really tell the difference. In fact, that building looks incredibly three-dimensional, even though it's a 2D drawing on top of just, basic block buildings. Pretty simple process, actually. But it has also a ghostly quality, which is kind of nice. Of course, you have to add people, kids playing, bunch of different things. Of course, I decided to go with this sort of grayed out people. Again, sort of just adding to the idea that there's supposed to be something a little off about this, that's supposed to have a feeling of an illusion. So here's an example of a layer that is set to a screen type, which is something I've talked about a couple times. I'm just going to turn it off. This is, again, another thing that you can get out of a rendering engine that we're not really going to cover right now. This is actually just all the reflections that were in my rendering. And if I were to set this to multiply, you can see it just brings all the black through. However, if I set this to screen, it essentially eliminates all the black in the scene. And the darker something is, the more it becomes transparent. So the white areas of the scene, like here, are going to have the biggest impact when you turn it to screen. And you can see basically that it allows it to become see-through. I don't know what layer or setting that was at, but something like that. This is same project again, just really going for that atmospheric quality. Same thing again, this time up on top of that structure you just saw. All the clouds here are actually a Photoshop brush. So in this case, I just Googled Photoshop cloud brush, and you can actually paint on clouds, and that's what I did here. They look pretty realistic, and they have a nice sort of cloud-like quality to them, as you can probably pretty clearly see. And it really helped the atmosphere of this image. I'm not going to go through all the layers here. There's quite a few of them, but just sort of getting at the point that layer management is, of course, incredibly important. And there's one other I was going to talk about. Oh, well, maybe a couple others. So this is a simpler image that, again, uses sort of simplified building forms. They're just context, just sort of simplified rectangles, and overlaid some interesting images of people. In this case, this was the Findlay Market area, which is something you'll become familiar with a little bit later on in the semester. And it's the basic rendering that started with it, overlaying a whole bunch of things. I'm gonna wait till I get to the people. So these people were actually cut out of an image of the market that was taken from this exact angle, and these are what the figures were doing in the historic image. The Findlay Market has been operating for over 100 years, so there's lots of different images that you can find of it across different generations. So I happened to find this one image that had a bunch of kids sort of playing, or maybe not playing. They look like they're in the Great Depression, so probably no play was happening whatsoever. But either way, I found them, and I sort of wanted to combine the two, and again, kind of playing with the idea of sort of manipulating an illusion. I also decided that I really wanted this to have a sort of painterly quality, so I've actually overlaid just images of watercolor. So you can see here, if I were to turn this up all the way, it's just some watercolor image that I found online that I set to an overlay type. Oop, there it is. And using a layer mask, which is a layer mask that I manipulated somewhat to have a gradient on it as well, which I can show you how to do. Basically allows it to, have the watercolor affect the edges around the building most and kind of fade off into the sky. And there's a few other things in here. Again, a material ID layer that I will cover at a later time. But that's a fun little one. And this one. So this is the last one, and I'll talk about real quickly. This is, again, same project, much earlier version, going with the sort of watercolor styling to keep it fairly nondescript. Not everything had been designed at this point, and ultimately got radically designed in a very different direction. So using the watercolor allowed it to be sort of detached from reality, as the project wasn't really finalized. But I'm going to turn all of my layers off. And the way I'm doing this is just clicking and holding and then dragging across. And that just essentially will select and turn on and turn off any layers that you drag over while you're clicking. So it's a good way to see all of them turn on at once if that's what you're going for. But I'm going to turn them all off real quick. So this is what it started with, which probably doesn't look too dissimilar from the images you might have just made in Rhino. And it's really not. It is slightly more advanced in that this was done with a renderer, so we can have some crisp reflections of the sky going on there, but really isn't that different than the type of thing we just did. Of course, so making this tile image and really isn't sort of out of the realm of possibilities with what you already know at this point. But mostly just overlaying things. Sort of, in this case, I have a image that is just essentially blue that I just painted on, and I wanted it to affect specific areas. So I have a layer mask that is only affecting the areas here that you can see in white. And the way this was done was actually just sort of taking the layer mask and then painting on it until I started to adjust it so that it only affected those areas. I have the similar thing happening here on that layer mask. And some of these are also assisted by the rendering engine, which give you some of this information, specifically that material ID layer that I mentioned. Turn some things back on here. Of course, overlaying that sort of context. I wanted it to appear as if there's two lakes here. There isn't. This is actually a parking lot, but that's okay. As part of the sort of dreamlike illusion that I was going for. Of course, more just textures of watercolor. In this case, that thing. Again, just random things I found online. In this case, I found it and actually mirrored it across itself so that the pattern would stretch better. Which, to do something like that, I'll just show you briefly. So I'm going to hit Control J, which on a Mac would be Command J, and all that does is copy the layer you have selected. And I'm just doing this so I can make some easy changes. So if I wanted to copy this guy and say mirror it across itself, I'm gonna bring it over here. If I just hold Alt and start moving that layer, I'll try it again, I'd write it off, it will create a duplicate. Now it's already mirrored because I had already done the mirroring, but if I hadn't, at this point I would just right click and do flip horizontal and then it would mirror up perfectly. But again, if it's already had that applied so that it already was going to work. And turn those off. Yeah, and that's kind of the basics of it. But what's key here is that, again, layers stack. So the lowest things are going to be the things that have everything else affected on them. All the other layers are applied to the layers beneath them. Any layers that you want, so you select these, you can put them into a folder. And this whole group, this whole folder here is above everything below it. And you can apply specifically, so say I want to apply a curves adjustment. I can apply it specifically to that group if I wanted to. And only that group. Now, I did that by holding Alt and hovering over it, and it will allow me to apply to specifically the group there. It can also be applied to a layer individually, but in this case, I was trying to do a folder. Okay, so that was some examples, hopefully a bit of explanation on layers and maybe some explanation on how layer masks work. I'm just going to show you how to make a gradient selection real quick. So there is a gradient tool here. I'm just going to create a new layer real quick. If I just start dragging, it's actually just going to paint a gradient, which I'm going to turn everything else on top of this off. Maybe what I want, maybe isn't. I'll do that real quick. If I wanted to make a gradient selection, so from being fully selected to not being selected, if I press the little button down here that has the rectangle with the circle in it, and then I draw a gradient, it's actually going to make a gradient selection. You can see here that I drew out the sort of red tone. If I turn this off, you can see I now have a selection. So if I were to start, say, painting, I want to paint a fully orange line. So you can see here, I don't know why it's different colors, but oh, it's because those things on above it. So I have a black line now. You can see here as I draw this, it starts to disappear. And that's because my gradient selection. Now the gradient selection isn't well represented by these little dashed lines because it's a single line representing a gradient. And it's actually showing the midway point where it goes between 50% white and 50% black. I could apply this gradient as a layer mask just by clicking there because it was selected, and you can see here, that's what that looks like. The other way of doing this is I'm just going to delete that layer mask, or delete the layer mask, and create a layer mask with nothing selected real quick. Oops, I did not do that right. This button's for layer mask. So I'm going to hold Alt to go to it. And now I could paint on a gradient if I wanted. And now that's a gradient that I have. So then if I wanted to, I could take something like another selection. So I'm just going to quickly cheat and use this guy. So if I wanted to use that layer mask to only apply to a particular area, so I'm going to use wand and say I want to select that part of the model. I'm going to select inverse now and delete, or actually I'll probably do not delete, but paint bucket and make that all black. So now I essentially have a gradient only on that part of the model. So if I were to start painting on that layer that I just made that for, it would affect only on this part of the model, and it would affect as a gradient moving across. Again, that's a much more advanced technique on how to start manipulating these layer filters, layer mask, I should say. But it is sort of a way that you can gain more control. All right, I think I'm going to end this one here. Thank you, everybody. Let me know if there's anything else I can cover, and I will try to make a video for it. Thanks.